So hi, I'm Rose.
And I'm also Rose.
And this is Rose Playing Games, where we're both named Rose and we like to play tabletop role-playing games. So this time we're going to be talking about representations of mental health in games, specifically like as stats or like mechanically, right? We will be touching a bit as well as like, is it a good representation, right? But we're talking about like, how do you turn this idea of like mental health into something that's a mechanic, right? So kind of like the earliest versions we see of this is like morale systems, right? You know, in war games and the original D&D, right? Sometimes a morale roll would be triggered. You roll like 2d6, and if you failed, then like the thing would run away, right? That'd be the monster, or that would be like a group of people in a war game, right? This is like sort of the earliest attempt to kind of like bring in that like sense of like, oh, fear is actually really important, right? That sort of Phobos, the god of fear, rules the battlefield.
Right, yeah, it was mental health as it pertains to military doctrine, which is about do your guys keep fighting and the other guys not keep fighting?
Yeah, which is very important.
Very important. There's a whole body of research about it that militaries have done because it's very important to them that stay high.
Yeah. Right, and there's like other board games and things like War of 1812 is one of my favorite, where you have dice, and every time you attack, like I think for the militia, like half the sides are run away, right? So you just roll a bunch of dice, and you just like people run away and run away and run away, and that's most of the casualties, right? But that sort of doesn't really feel like it's kind of getting that much at it. It's sort of just touching on it very briefly. I think sort of the earliest thing that most people are familiar with then would be the sanity system from Call of Cthulhu, right? This is a fairly straightforward thing, right? You start out with a big pool of sanity, like, 70, 80 or whatever, right? And then over time, you like death by 1,000 cuts, lose little bits of sanity at a time. And eventually when you run out of sanity, your character goes mad, right? And is no longer playable. And along the way, you gain some psychological conditions, right? Like maybe you suddenly start having multiple personalities or OCD or whatever.
Yeah, right. That's the classic one. That's what everyone is that's what everyone thinks of when you talk about these sorts of mechanics in role-playing games.
And like that's a system that like is interesting, right? Mostly in that sense of like it sort of fits with the themes of the genre. It sort of has this doom spiral to it. But obviously the idea of suddenly acquiring multiple personalities is just really silly and unrealistic and right, like things can happen in response to trauma, but like there's lots of things that just don't develop in response to trauma. That's not how they work. They're more genetic, or they more come from early life experiences. And so this often comes off as kind of like ridiculous.
Right. And also, honestly, this is something I have always personally taken issue with, because it's not even really consistent with how these things were depicted in the writings of Lovecraft.
Yeah, can you say a bit more about that?
Right, because, okay, I've read a bunch of Lovecraft. So really it's that the idea of this unitary sanity doesn't even really map to the stories. The stories people have a lot of, sure, they're known for having people having often a lot of mental issues, but they're kind of different circumstantial mental issues. Sometimes they're just straight up someone gets really stressed out and goes through a really bad situation and has PTSD afterwards.
Yeah, which
but it's like
pretty
but like some of them, it's not even it's just because there was a scary thing. It's nothing. It's not even really directly supernatural. Some of them do involve like hallucinations or something like that, but they tend to be because there is a supernatural entity contacting you. Sometimes there are like characters like I think Rats in the Walls, where the character does seem to just have started out with having potentially some kind of
hey kitty
issue that just gets exacerbated by the circumstance. So it's really quite variable, and the sanity rules don't really represent that.
Yeah, right. And it's also kind of doesn't fit with this idea of like being unsure of what reality is, right? Because that's really often what this is kind of trying to represent, is that your character's view of what is reality is being shaken by their contacts with things that they thought were impossible, right? And like by putting the label sanity on it, it kind of implies that all your realizations are fake, right? When really often it's implied to be the other way around, that our normal understanding of reality is the fake one, or is sort of not real.
Well, I mean, that it... Oh, sorry. Well, I mean, actually, it's I wouldn't necessarily like it. There is the sense that what you're learning is real. It's trying to go on the cosmic horror idea that what the actual truth is something that human beings aren't well equipped to deal with. The cosmic horror thing is that like the truth is that we're meaningless and we could die at any moment because a god just like turns over in bed.
Yeah.
And that's not fun to think about. And the more you learn about it, then the more you aren't doing well. Like you're protected by your ignorance.
Yeah, right. But it's that you're protected by ignorance is kind of like the sort of the thrust of often that, right? Whereas labeling it sanity kind of implies that
the label, right?
Mm-hmm. I think definitely other games have done a better job of sort of capturing like this idea of like eldritch corruption is really more what I view it as, right? So one of these games here, the Veins of the Earth, has Rapture, right? Which is sort of basically this idea that as you spend time in their sort of underworld, right, you become more and more of a weird cave dweller, right? So there's some abilities you can gain, like when you're naked, you can detect the size and shape of the space around you, right? Your pupils become permanently dilated so you can see better in the dark, right? You become obsessed with like keeping your weight low, right? To like manage through small spaces. Right, all things that are like very specific to the setting and to the experiences of the characters and don't necessarily map very well onto sort of real life diagnoses.
Right.
Right. And this is kind of where we get into talking about the difficulty of like using the DSM, right, as inspiration for your sanity system, and that the DSM has a lot of problems already, right? And that it tends to sort of put things in these neat little boxes, but all the boxes bleed over and overlap with each other. And there's been other attempts to create systems that sort of deal with that better, right? Which I'll talk more about later, right? But it's sort of like, and then the other big downside is that when you use DSM categories, there's a good chance that you're sort of directly commenting on the experiences of potentially people at your table or people that they know, and you might be doing it in a way that's kind of judgy, right? Because the DSM often is kind of judgy, right? It sort of views things as disorders and problems and flaws, right? And so I think in reaction to that, people have started to lean more on like stress systems, right? That's been sort of like, I think the next go-to is that, let's not worry about like the idea of disorders, right? Or these long-term mental effects. Let's just focus on like this universal human experience of stress, right? Blades in the Dark uses a stress system, right? Where basically you can take stress to do things better. Stress sometimes just happens to you, right? And if you max out on stress, you basically can't do anything, right? It's an alternative health bar, right? Instead of hit points, you also have stress. It's a little bit weird in that one of the main ways of managing your stress in Blades of the Dark is through addiction, right? Which kind of makes sense in its setting, right? But it's also just like not, it's sort of like true to how addiction works, but it's also really not, right? And that addiction often makes you more stressed, right? But it temporarily relieves the stress.
Well, I mean, it lets you, it's not just addiction, because there's also like, you can go to church.
Yeah.
That's a vice, according to the system, which is interesting.
Yeah, it frames the ways that you deal with your mental health as vices, right? Which makes sense in this really like bleak, grimdark, post-apocalyptic setting that like, there's no good way to feel good about the world.
Yeah, it has a kind of a noir sensibility where, being in this town, doing the things you do, you end up hitting the bottle.
Yeah, right? That's this inevitable pull towards self-destruction, right? And that sort of contrasts with some other games where, in that system, it's sort of the inevitable pull towards self-destruction. It's kind of similar to the sanity system, sort of pull towards this death spiral, right? And if you look at some other games, especially ones that use conditions, it's more about kind of going in and out of states, right? So Masks comes to mind, the superhero game, right, where you can gain conditions like frightened, angry, insecure, right, these sorts of things, and they impose a temporary penalty, right? So, for example, if you're frightened, you can't, trying to like fight is really hard and bad, right, until you run away, and then you stop being frightened, right? And the real benefit of these conditions is that they encourage suboptimal play, right, which is often something you kind of want to do in a role-playing game. It's kind of a big advantage of role-playing games is that you can encourage people to do stuff that's suboptimal, which, in other board games, other types of games, people will often just do the most optimal thing, even if it's boring, right? Whereas most people, even people who are sort of power gamers, right, will still kind of consider a little bit like, oh, what would my character do, right? What makes sense, right? Oh, sure, I could carry a bag of rats around and slowly kill one by one to trigger my effect, right? Or these classic kind of like munchkin-y gamer moves. But most people won't do that because they realize that it's absurd or like doesn't make sense in the fiction, right? And this is sort of part of the power of role-playing. And then a sort of a building onto that conditions is stuff that's like a little longer lasting. I'm thinking of like the darkest self in Monster Hearts. Monster Hearts is based on an apocalypse setting that's paranormal sort of teen romance drama. You're like going to high school and some of you are vampires and werewolves. It's Twilight, it's Buffy, it's, various things. And darkest self is basically like when you flip into the most monstrous or worst version of your character. Right? So for a vampire, that might mean viewing humans as mere cattle, blood sacks to be drained, right? Being cold and callous and disdainful, right? For the werewolf, it might be lost to rage and hunger and, going on a rampage.
Werewolf stuff,
right? But one of my favorite examples is actually of the Fae character, right? So it says, everything you say is a promise. Everything you hear is also a promise, right? If a promise is broken, justice must be delivered of blood, right? And to escape your darkest self, you have to sort of rebalance the scales of justice. And I feel like this is just such a fun prompt for a way to play your character for a bit, right? To really lean into that sort of like obsessive, like lawyeriness, right? Of the Fae, right? Of you said exactly this, right? But with this sort of violent tinge. And I think this actually kind of in a metaphorical way captures some of the like what it's like to be in a mental health episode, right? Where you kind of just become like your normal sort of difficult tendencies sort of get exaggerated and blown out of proportion. And you do stuff you wouldn't normally do, right? Stuff that later you might be really ashamed of or not proud of, right?
Yeah, and I think there's actually something to be said for that idea of slipping into a certain mode where you play that out, because at least in my experience, when a game has things where, okay, if you have this particular trait and you need to play it to get like a fate aspect kind of thing, and you play it to get a bonus. I mean, unless the game is really hammering on that, I found that people often forget about that. It kind of gets lost in the shuffle a little bit.
Yeah, you're focusing on so many other things, right?
Right.
It's easy to kind of forget it, or just sort of like not lean on it, because it often means doing things that are suboptimal, that piss off other players, that are weird.
But I think when it's more like you are now in this state, and it's like this is the role playing prompt for what you are doing right now, it's almost a little bit easier. It's like, okay, well, now I'm going to fully lean into that, my werewolf rage or something. Yeah. And then you don't have to do that the rest of the time. You can act a little more normal and just play more optimally speaking, but you're kind of given this, this like social permission to do these other things.
The kinds of things you wouldn't normally do, to be the villain for a moment. It's actually kind of interesting in that some of the GM advice in Monster Art says, drive your NPCs like stolen cars, right? Like, do not care about their safety or well-being at all. Do reckless stuff, right? Because that's part of what's fun, right? And you're basically giving that same advice to the player when you say darkest self. You're like, hey, drive your character like they're a stolen car for a bit, right? Don't care about their health, don't care about their well-being, don't care about their relationships. Just like indulge your worst impulses, do stuff that sort of is like dramatic, right? And so, I think conditions are really great for representing these sort of temporary emotional states, right? Or these sort of bouts or episodes. But I think they do kind of often fail to sort of get into that like longer lasting stuff, right? I think that's maybe more a bigger part of a character's personality, right? Or sort of consistently affecting them, right?
Which is really hard to do, though, because like those things can be very nuanced and are really hard to codify.
Yeah, so one system I think actually does a surprisingly good job of this is the belonging outside belonging games. I'm thinking in particular of Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast. There's a character, so Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast is basically you play a children's cartoon show, right? There's a bed and breakfast run by a witch named Yazeba, and you'll play zany characters who come in and out, and each session is basically like a little TV episode, right? And there's this character called Mr. Boggs. And Mr. Boggs is a guy in a suit who seems to be some sort of like office worker or something, but he's holding an umbrella that is always raining on him, right? He's just permanently being rained on at all times, right? And he has sort of a soggy personality, right? And And the way belonging outside belonging works is you have these things called, in this game, they're called whoopsies, right? But in other games, they're called weak moves, where they're basically a negative aspect of your character, something that's so optimal that if you do, gives you a token so you can do something more helpful later, right? And so one of them is like rain on someone's parade, right? And so this, we've both experienced depression, right? This tendency when you're depressed to view the whole world through the lens of your depression. And even though you don't want to be negative about everything, you kind of are, right? And that can sometimes impact your relationships and impact other people where you're telling you positive news and you're like, look, who cares? Nothing matters, right?
Right. And it's interesting because that system is diceless, and you're just like the equivalent of like failing is a weak move. But instead of it being like when you roll dice, it tends to be like it's framed in like your circumstances or something like that. With weak moves, they tend to be framed around the idea of this is something that didn't work because of your personal issues.
Yeah, right. They're really aspects of who your character is and their flaws and failures, right? But the idea that then that it goes hand in hand with sort of leading to the more positive aspect, that you get this token that then you spend on like doing other more positive things, like this person can encourage someone's entrepreneurial spirit or like shelter someone with their umbrella, right? That in some way there's this intrinsic connection, right, between sort of like our shadow self, our darker self, right, the darker sides of ourself, and our more positive aspects, that you can't have one without the other, right? I feel like that's a kind of a really nice kind of warm perspective on it, right?
Although I mean, you could kind of argue that it's taking more of a narrative logic than like, because I feel like in actuality, like when you mess up, you don't get a token. If anything, it makes you feel worse.
Yes,
but like that's a doom spiral, and games don't usually like to create doom spirals,
except for Call of Cthulhu,
unless you're doing Call of Cthulhu.
But it's not necessarily directly that negative things lead to positive things, but more that both are intrinsic parts of who you are in this more abstract sense, and that you can't sort of have one without the other, right? That you can't have your positive aspects without also having some negative aspects. Characters can also grow and change in those games, and like they might leave behind some of their weak moves, right? And I'm thinking of another game.
Well, I was
going to say, more to say about?
Well, I was going to, going back to Monster Hearts. It has the concept of you can get moves that I can't remember what it calls them, but there's like kind of growing up, maturing moves where you get to like replace your normal way, your previous ways of socially interacting with like fundamentally like kinder, more mature, more pro-social ways of doing things, where you mediate between people instead of just like throwing your weight around and that sort of thing.
Yeah, this is what I was going to get to do. Some games kind of try to bake mental health into sort of the core stats, right? So Monster Hearts does this to some extent by having moves like cold, right, where it's like acting coolly, shutting people down, being kind of cruel. And
like all of your stats are describing you as a person. They're not really about your skills.
They're more about like your behavior and emotions, right? Which is sort of what mental health is. It's both behavior, what other people see you doing, but also your own internal states. Though the stats are more about how it appears to other people, how it affects other people, right? When you're being cold, it implies an emotional state, but directly it's about shutting people down, right? Being dismissive, these sorts of things. And then when you grow up, you can then instead like sort of be calm under pressure, right? You kind of get a more positive version of the same thing, where this, tendency to shut off your emotion turns an ability to in a more nuanced way, regulate yourself, right? And then I'm thinking of another game called Unknown Armies, which I don't know as much about, but I did notice that when I was looking into this, that it has this sort of like sliding stat system, right? Where basically, lasers and feelings is a great example of like a sliding stat, right? Where you have one bar that goes from all lasers to all feelings and steps in between. And the more lasers you have, the less feelings you have, and so on, right? So in like the Star Trek setting, if you're high in the feelings end, then you're not so good at the science stuff. Whereas if you're Spock and you know all the logic and science stuff, then you have no feelings. And this kind of plays into like personality systems, things like the Big Six, right? This like introvert extrovert dichotomy, right? Or conscientiousness versus disagreeableness, and like all these things. And And
which there has been some interesting research talking about in the context of gaming, trying to talk about like groupings of people and what they're interested in with games and the way that they involve themselves with a game or with other people.
yeah, I think I saw one. Did you see the same blog post where it's talking about like extroversion and sort of competitiveness in games, right?
Yeah, there was one. Yeah, there was one about extroversion and like excitement were linked in a way that was not traditionally found.
But it was specifically that like competitiveness and socialness were actually more connected and clustered.
I think we're talking about the same thing.
We're talking about the same one. So in the previous game typologies, then it'd be like, oh, social players like in WoW are very different from the competitive players. But certainly in my experience, like the most social players are often people who are playing things like team shooters or Dota, right? Or like these things that require a group of people to work together. Or we think about real world sports, right? Often a very social but very competitive experience. And that those are both kind of linked to this underlying trait of extroversion, right?
Right, which isn't just being more social. There's more of well, I mean, you would be able to describe it better, actually.
Yeah, right. That extroversion, in addition to being more social, also includes things like kind of being a bit aggressive, right? Or being more confident, right? These things that, kind of have their dark side, right? One of the downsides of the big six is that they very much often lean one way or another about which side of the scale is good.
Oh, and extroversion is the good side.
Yeah, right? Or even worse, conscientiousness versus like disagreeableness or something, right? And that's something that I kind of feel like not all games do a great job of exploring, which is basically the social constructedness of all these categories, right? That, things like depression, right? It's like that has a cultural labeling and understanding of something that is maybe a more universal phenomenon, right? But especially, other more specific things like eating disorders are very cultural, right? They're very much about like a culture's attitudes towards food and eating rituals, right? And what's considered attractive, right? And if you go back to like 14th century France, right? Like it's not going to be the same, right? People might experience some of the same things. There might be people who have obsessions around food, but the way they think about it and the reasons why they're doing it are going to be like totally different, right? And that's something that I feel like could use a little more exploration, the sense of like, oh, not necessarily what are your intrinsic qualities, but more about like, how do you present to the world, right? How does the world understand you as either sane or insane and how you get categorized, right? I was talking a bit about unknown armies. Right, yes. So they've got the sliding scale of like 5 stats that are various dimensions of sort of like effects of trauma.
Which is actually, I believe, was made in direct response to Call of Cthulhu's sanity system, addressing that thing I was talking about of like, I feel like it should in fact be split up a little bit more, that just sanity isn't really capturing the nuance of it.
Yeah, so splitting it up and then also making it so as you advance farther in a category, right? It's not like all negative, right? It's more nuanced than that. It's like, oh, you actually get better at some things, worse at others. Overall, it's generally pretty bad, right? But in some ways, it makes you better at coping with these extreme situations that your character gets put into.
Right, although you can choose to cope with it differently. Like you can choose to become hardened to something, which makes you resist it, but it also makes you more callous, and you're now closed off, and you're harder for other people to reach.
Yeah, right. And this represents like a pretty classic response to trauma, right? Which is numbing out, hardening, right? Sort of cutting yourself off from your compassion, your openness to other people as a way to protect yourself, right? And I think it's really cool to see games kind of represent that when they're playing with these darker themes of like trauma, and so I'm kind of looking at all this, and I also looked into some other smaller games that sort of deal more directly with mental health as well. I looked at this very weird like meta game called Power Kill. Have you heard of Power Kill? Mm-hmm. Right, where basically you play a normal game of D&D, and you set aside some time after the session, right, to then do a counseling group therapy session, right, where the counselor says, oh, do you have delusions about killing dragons and looting dungeons? How do you feel about people who are physiologically different from you in some way? Do you think that they're hostile, right? And these sort of like leading questions, and the idea is that basically like you are a person who has a delusion of being a Dungeons and Dragons character, right? I don't know if I would find that super satisfying, right? I feel like it kind of misses the point a little bit of like this idea of like role play as metaphor, as alternative self exploration. It comes off as like a bit judgmental of the idea.
Oh, it is judgmental. I mean, honestly, I don't know. I feel like that is more of a lyric game than anything else. Like it's, I feel like it's meant to be read and thought about it more so than actually played.
Yeah, I could see versions of it. Like, so I'm thinking about some of the scenarios where, again, blurring the line between reality, unreality. I'm thinking of something like the newest Matrix, actually, right? Where Neo is basically working in a game design place and is going to the counselor, and the counselor's like, oh, yeah, you have all these delusions of like being a super powered person in a virtual reality, right? And well, being a horrible counselor the whole time, that guy gave me the ick immediately, right?
Yeah.
But it sort of points to this like, oh, right, like when we're playing with questions of what is reality, bringing in questions of sanity just makes sense, right? That it's like, oh, the system might be pushing you to consider yourself insane, right? To sort of view your own experiences as inauthentic, right? And that's sort of like existential uncertainty that comes when you can no longer trust your own experiences.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that in Cult.
Oh, I don't know about this one.
With a K. It's an older game, although it did get a more recent, I think, like a PBTA rewrite. There, it's like it has this kind of like Gnostic cosmology where the world is fake and a series of illusions layered atop each other, ruled by dark gods. It's a horror setting. Like most of the character, like all of the characters end up having like dark secrets about like having suffered trauma and being part of cults, as you might expect from the name. It's a very grim setting, but it definitely has a lot of that kind of thing.
Yeah, it does make sense that a lot of the games that really explore these mental health themes are horror games, right? There's some exceptions, like I was talking about Eusebio's Bed and Breakfast, right? But horror has always been a medium that's been kind of very interested in the psychological, right?
Yeah, for good or ill, a lot of times it's very sensationalized. Sometimes not, depends.
Yeah, sometimes it's sort of madness is sort of this threatening danger, right? That the crazy people are going to come kill you, right? But I think, psychological horror at its best is more about like the fear of being considered mad, or of being mad, or of not having a shared conception of reality with everyone around you. I remember reading The Shining, and none of the supernatural stuff scared me. It was the character's internal narration of, am I losing my mind? Right? At the time, I was going through a bad mental health time in middle school, and I was like, oh yeah, am I losing my mind? Right? Like, how would I even know? Right? What would it take to be a member of the insane? Would I even know if that was happening? Right? And that really spooked me. And I also looked into some other games, right? Like Don't Rest Your Head, speaking of Stephen King novels, right? There's a Stephen King book, I think it's called Insomnia, where it's about this like older man who can't sleep. And then he realizes that if you don't sleep long enough and have bad enough insomnia, then actually you have superpowers and go into this weird supernatural realm of people who can't sleep and have to fight off weird gnomes.
As someone who has had insomnia for years, I wish that were true. It sounds cool.
Yeah, that obviously this is a fantastical imagining, right? But there's this game that's basically taking that premise that like these people who can't sleep, but then, you get these superpowers, but then you're also being hunted by nightmares, which are like these evil supernatural beings. And then, madness in that setting, you roll, you can add a madness die to potentially get a better result. But if you roll high on it, then you're triggered into either a fight or flight response, right? And which is kind of leaning less into like the idea of madness as like disorder and more into this like stress response, right? And then if that happens too many times, then your overall like capacity to do stuff is decreased, right? So it does have a bit of that death spiral thing going on as well. Something that I was definitely thinking about. So I'm a counselor. I don't know if I mentioned that up top, but it's relevant.
No,
right?
you didn't, but it's worth mentioning.
So obviously I have a lot of experience with mental health, and one of the main types of counseling I do is this thing called internal family systems. In this sort of type of therapy, it's like if you've heard the phrase inner child, that's kind of where this comes from, right? Where you have these different parts of the self that represent different parts of your personality and experiences. They play different roles, right? There's sort of protector parts, right? There might be like a controlling sort of inner critic, right? That's always trying to get you to like do better, right? Or there might be like a sort of avoidant part that's trying to get you to like numb out, avoid pain through like addiction or procrastination or just trying not to feel your feelings. And then this exile part, which is like the inner child, right? The part that holds all your most vulnerable experiences, memories, thoughts, feelings. And that often gets kind of pushed away, ignored by other parts who are trying to protect it, but also suffocating it. And then the core self, which is just sort of like the center of who we are, which then we sort of use that along with compassion to sort of heal and understand these other parts. I think this would be a great basis for a mental health system in a role-playing game, because you can kind of take that sanity and split it up into 3 parts and sort of being like, Delta Green actually has this kind of cool mechanic where when you lose sanity, instead you could push it out onto your relationships.
Amazing mechanic.
Best part of the sanity system. That it has other flaws,
sure,
right? But the idea that then you could push it onto internal parts, you can kind of choose like, oh, which part of me takes the burden of this stress, right? Do I lean into trying to control the situation, right, and becoming increasingly anxious and worried and perfectionistic, or do I lean into avoidance and sort of numb out and become disconnected, or do I just get overwhelmed, right, and let that happen, right, and be less functional in the moment, but maybe not deal with that same long-term shutdown, right? And sort of introducing a element of choice, I think, could also be helpful, because sometimes it can kind of feel like, especially we're playing Delta Green, I feel like often sanity checks, you roll them a lot, and it's just like, well, you don't ever make a choice. It's just like a thing that's happening to you.
You can make a choice to some extent of like, don't read the book, except you kind of want to read the book.
Also, if you literally made that choice consistently, nothing would happen.
Exactly. You want to do that. That's the point. That's the buy-in of the game.
Yeah, if you just like avoided everything that might cause sanity loss, you would not be playing Delta Green. You'd be like, I sit at home and do nothing.
Right.
I avoid interacting with the horse.
I have a normal life. Look the other way.
Right. Whereas thinking about like, oh, okay, you can't avoid the stress and difficulty in these things that are happening, but you can choose sort of like which direction it's going to develop your character in.
Right. Which as we were talking about, Unknown Armies does some of.
Yeah. Right. So those are most of my main thoughts about sort of mental health systems. Oh, I did have one other actually. I'm looking over at my notes, is externalization. Right? So this is where instead of trying to represent the character's internal state, you make internal parts just part of the game world, right? So I think a great game that does this, I don't know if the game's great, but a great example of this is Triangle Agency, right? So this is a game where you're part of like a weird government bureaucracy thing.
Well, it's like a corporation.
It's like a corporation. I thought it also worked for the government, didn't it?
Maybe.
Anyway, you're part of like a weird bureaucracy thing that's kind of corporate. And the idea is that you're trying to like go deal with these anomalies which spawn out of people's intense thoughts, right? And obviously understanding how those spawned and where they came from is a big part of the game, but it's a great example of like, oh, why don't we take that thing inside of someone's head and just put it out in the world to interact with, right? I think there's some classic D&D monsters that kind of have a bit of this metaphorical vibe.
It's also a very classic horror thing to do.
Yeah, right? And I think it really helps in that it's like, oh, now we can use all these other systems we've developed to sort of play around with and interact with this internal state, right? That we're not having to reduce it down to a single number, right? But we're sort of metaphorically allowing the players to deal with it in a whole variety of different ways, right? Do you try to work with it? Do you try to like calm it down? Do you fight it, right? Do you try to rationalize with it, right? Like, how do you interact with this thing that's behaving in a way that's outside of the norm, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a system that is very compelling a lot of the time, right? But it does have the downside in that it's often, one of the benefits of sanity systems is they encourage you to reflect on what your character is thinking and feeling, right? Whereas this does focus more on external action, right?
Right.
Unless the external entity is built in such a way that it then prompts that, right? So, for example, if you run into a shade that then makes you experience, memories of your worst losses, right? Your worst moments of grief you experience when you run into this, right? That's a great role-playing prompt. It gets you to explore and think about your character, right? But it's sort of externalized as this monster.
Right.
So yeah, those are sort of my main thoughts. Like,
yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Okay, I mean, actually, a few things have come up while we were talking about the. Let me think. So I was gonna say stress is an interesting topic, because a lot of games have moved towards using it as almost as a replacement for sanity, but almost just kind of a straight replacement. Like and then kind of acting like that's a big deal, and it's just a renaming. Like I remember when Darkest Dungeon came out, I remember
which basically is a sanity system,
right? But I remember reading like an article like praising it as being like a better representation of like mental health because it didn't have that issue with sanity. But it is just a sanity system.
It's almost identical to the Call of Cthulhu.
You gain points of stress from dealing with eldritch horrors, and then if you get too much stress, you now develop a random mental disorder. It is the exact same thing. It's just a renaming. They called it stress. Now, you could argue maybe perhaps that is slightly better.
But it's like,
it's a little
who
less
cares?
judgy, but it's the same goofy thing where you just have like, oh, I'm a kleptomaniac now because I
Right?
saw a scary monster.
That's the thing. Actually, that's another point about sanity systems is that they're often about this sort of descent into madness, which thematically makes sense. But most people's actual experience with mental health is that it gets to a point where it's real bad, and then you do things to make it better, right? And you improve, and it never really goes away. But often people's experience is that it might be at their worst in their teens or as a young adult or when it first shows up, and that there's a long recovery process. There's some games that include things like therapy, like Eclipse Phase and things. But, I really think there's more opportunity for like character growth in terms of like understanding your relationship with mental illness, of being like, oh, your character starts out right with some of these traits, right? Oh, maybe you start out like with an impulse to steal things, and then learning how to deal with that is part of how your character grows.
This is a good time to bring up Chubo's Marvelous Wish Granting Engine.
Oh, I've heard of this, but I don't really know that much
It
about
is
it.
so worth reading. I'm always going to tell people to read Jenna Moran games. I think she's the best. But in any event, it's a big topic because that game is complicated. But there's a lot of interlocking parts. But basically, everything in that game is built around arc, what it calls an arc in the sense of a character arc.
Yeah.
Like you have a kind of a character class, but they're based on having a personal journey, kind of emotional narrative journey.
Yeah,
that
right.
you'll
You're
have
like the hero, or you're like
Right.
overcoming a flaw. or-
Right. And a lot of them are about like some of them are like the green, or like I think it's called sickness issues, where arcs rather, where you something is trying to change you, and it can be dealt with it like it's like maybe a supernatural like corrupting thing, or you're becoming, where you're like physically becoming something. But it can also just be like social forces are trying to get you to be a different person than you want to be inside, and you can get to a point of like making a choice about whether or not you want to become this new thing, or whether or not you want to resist it or become it, but on your own terms, and keep part of who you used to be.
Okay, that's really fascinating.
And then subcomponent of that is there's arcs, which are big on top, and then those are split down into a set of quests, which are also like a set of like triggers of like these things happening, and then you get XP for coming into a bunch of like emotional situations, having reactions to things. There's actually a system where you can get XP for having reaction shots to what other people are doing. And then one of the main ways that you would take conditions in the game is what's called an issue, which is a sort of like a really compressed version of an arc, where they can be things like where like you were feeling empty and alienated, or like you now have to deal with a new situation in your life. You can get depressed and angry and so on, and these are handled as issues that you deal with over a longer period of time, and certain things advance that issue, and it usually gets worse and worse, but then you get to a certain point and you can resolve it.
Okay, that actually is a really interesting depiction of things.
Like there's a whole concept of things getting bad, but the game is fundamentally very hopeful and wants you to get over things through the hard effort of like learning to live with yourself and be in harmony with the world.
Wow. So that's really cool. I was reading this thing talking about going back to Eldritch Corruption, right, where it proposes like 3-act structure to it, right, of like exposure and then obsession and then a choice, right? Which is, I think, sort of very similar to the arc structure, but in a sort of a darker setting, right? Where it's like, oh, you get exposed to the negative thing, right? And then you go through this period of obsessing about it, thinking about it all the time, it becoming a bigger part of who you are. And there's this choice of like kind of leaning further in or pushing away, right? Whereas, it sounds like in this, what was the game called again?
Chubos.
Marvelous Wish Granting Engine.
Wish Granting Engine.
Right? It's more about like, oh, you kind of know what the end of the arc is going to be in some ways, right? You get to define it some, but the end of the arc is generally getting better, right? Which is this kind of like hopefulness to it, right? That like, oh, things can get better, right? I'm thinking of like the show Heartstopper, when they have to deal with when the main character's eating disorder, chooses to sort of view it as a retrospective, like he's in therapy talking about how he's gotten better when you see all the scenes where he's suffering the most. And I kind of feel like there's more room for stuff like that in games to be like, hey, we're going to put your character through the hard stuff, but because this is a game, you can have this like built-in promise that like things are going to get better, which you don't necessarily get in real life.
There's a concept that I think I first saw it in the game Inspectors, which is like a kind of Ghostbusters sort of premise. I think it called it a confessional, where you could you could pause a situation to trigger a kind of like reality show style mini interview with your character from in the future talking about that situation in retrospect. You can just cut to like, man, I was so stressed out at that point, and then it like becomes a way to get out of it. It's actually very similar structurally to the way Blades does flashbacks, but it's flashing forward to a point after, and kind of you presumably gotten out of it somehow.
Yeah.
But it's mostly framed in terms of like you talking about how you felt at the time.
Yeah, and that's sort of like, that's almost more what I wanted from like these metagame like Power Kill. Power Kill kind of really frames it as like, oh, your delusional fantasy of murdering people, right? But I'm like, what a missed opportunity to really delve into the inside of a character, right? And sort of be like, oh, like, what would your raging barbarian say in therapy, right? I want to know, right? I had another thought and I've lost it. Oh, well, it's gone. Oh, I was thinking about interactions between characters, right? So, and some of the things like the conditions and stuff often have an end condition, right? So if you're frightened, you can run away. If you're angry, you can strike out against someone else. But I think some of the ones like Insecure can actually be ended by other characters. I'm not 100% sure, right? But definitely in Monster Heart, some of the end conditions to Darkest Self are things that other characters can do to you, right? Like, character's really insecure, and then you get reassured by someone close to you, right? And then that helps you get out of it. And I really feel like that's such a great opportunity, right? In a role-playing game to really give people this very like visceral way of helping another character, right? Of being like, oh, you're not able to do something right now. Let me help you out.
Right. Which is something that shows up in there's a few games. It's essential part of the game Necronica. It's about being.
I can't believe how many games you know sometimes. What the heck is Necronica?
So there's a Japanese tabletop RPG author, Ryo Kamiya. Kind of a questionable guy in certain ways, disclaimer, but has some interesting game design. Necronica is a game about being like undead girls in the post-apocalypse. It's actually cool. It's actually like they're like young girls, partially because anime, but also because it's intentionally supposed to be like people who are not as naturally equipped to handle these horrific, like, constant warfare situations.
Yeah, who are very vulnerable.
Right, and you take what it calls madness. You take points and you, like, put those onto your mementos of the past, of the person you used to be. And there's a big part of the game is making what it calls conversation checks, where you can, like, where you only survive because you cling to one another and are constantly trying to do things where, like, well, no, we're encouraging each other, we're trying to calm each other down, because this is awful. Being what we are is an inherently nightmarish experience, and the only way we can get through it is by having each other.
that rules. And this is something that I feel like clerics in D&D, I wish had more opportunities to do, and there's more systems around, right? It feels like the cleric, as much as they should be physically healing people, should be spiritually and psychologically healing people, right? They should be giving people the pep talk, or the fighter can, right? Like this sense, there's all these beats and stories about groups where it's about helping each other, right? That's kind of a core theme of the idea of like being a team, right? Is this one person has a moment of despair and needs inspiration and help from someone else, right?
Yeah.
I'm thinking Sam and Frodo, obviously.
Right.
Right? And their wonderful gay relationship.
Yeah, I think we've talked about once before. It's there's a game called X Crawl that has a mechanic where there's a pool of points you can get that you can add to checks, but it represents your unity as a team. And the rule that I love from an otherwise not amazing game, but I love this rule so much, is that you cannot take a point from the pool. It can only be given to you by someone else, and if you ask for it, then you can't get it anymore. It has to be given freely because someone else realized that you needed it in that moment.
Yeah. Someone had to pay attention and realize this person needs help.
So good.
Right?
Yeah, I was in a different somewhat earlier Ryo Kamiya game, Maid. It's a like super like goofy anime
this, where
kind
you're all
of
playing maids and the weird master's about to come home, and you have to,
you're trying to gain favor with the master. But that actually has a stress mechanic that is kind of fun. Stress is kind of your hit points because you don't really get hurt. It's not that kind of game. Where you get stressed out by things, and then if your stress goes too high, you hit what's called a stress explosion, which is actually very similar structurally to Darkest Self, except it's stuff like you go and overeat to a comical extent, or like do a variety of like reckless and self-indulgent, or like you go gamble at a horse race or something.
These things that encourage you to do things that are outside of what might be beneficial to your character, right? But really are funny,
right? And it's cathartic, and that's how you how you deal with your stress,
right? And I think that's an advantage of stress systems, and a reason to include them in games is they just really expand the range of things that you can apply this kind of like resource management gameplay to, right? That like obviously in violent combat, hit points make sense, but there's so many games that aren't about that, right? But it's very helpful to have this resource to kind of measure like, how am I doing, right? Oh, am I in trouble, right? But obviously hitting 0 and just like dying doesn't make a lot of sense, and so instead you have to come up with other consequences. What happens when you get maxed out in stress? What happens when you can't cope anymore, right? And often the answer is some kind of meltdown, right? Some kind of blowing up, acting out. And I do think those are really interesting character moments. And one of the benefits of having some sort of a mental health or stress system in a game is that they encourage you to kind of lean into how are the events of the game affecting your character.
Yeah. Trying to think of other things. There's a somewhat lesser known PBTA game called Action Movie World, which is exactly what it sounds like.
Okay.
But it has a really interesting way of one of its primary social moves is that you express an emotion. And it's described in terms of your action movie characters. So all of your emotions are big and very physically represented. And it's that you express an emotion and you're trying to cause that emotion in other people. And like if you get a mixed success, like you make them feel what you want them to feel, and you get caught up in that feeling too. And you're just all angry now, or all sad, or all happy.
That kind of rules.
Right. It's actually surprisingly really from a game that's about action movies, actually one of the more interesting social mechanics I've seen.
Kind of talking about this like emotional contagion that we as humans experience, right? Where this is something obviously I deal with all the time as a counselor, right? Where dealing with sad people makes you kind of sad, and you got to know how to deal with that, right? And that's a big part of the skill of being a counselor, is learning how to sort of weather those tides of emotion, right? How much to sort of get involved in that emotional contagion and be there with the other person, and then how much to sort of pull back and sort of being like, okay, that's their sadness, right? Not mine, right? Or their fear or whatever, right? And I think that's really interesting to see that represented in an action movie game, right? I do want to have role-playing games that are about therapy. I might have to write them myself. But I think
it's talk to me about one of them.
It's such a. I definitely had this one that's been swimming around my head for a while of just like being a robot therapist. I'm never sure how that's gonna work, right? But the idea of like being a robot therapist who has only a predetermined set of things you can say, and you have to then respond to people with them, right? I think that's just really funny to me, because there is this thing with sort of active listening skills. Where there's often not that many different ways to just basically say, I understand what you're saying, right? There's like, oh, it sounds like, oh, I can imagine, or you must feel, or da-da-da-da. There's sort of these like stock phrases that you end up using over and over, and people tend not to notice because they're busy expressing their emotions. But often when you're practicing these skills as a counselor, it feels very robotic, right? When you're first learning them, right? It feels kind of like not authentic. And later you kind of learn more how to wrap it into normal conversation. But I do find that idea very fun, the idea of like, oh, what happens if a robot did have to do therapy, right? How would they manage that? Right? But yeah, I think that's pretty much all my thoughts that I had going on for now. Do you have any final thoughts?
I mean, yeah, I guess the ultimate, like, the summary of a lot of this is that, like, mental health has been historically very poorly represented. We have gotten a lot better at it. I think we could still get even better at it to be even now, not necessarily just getting more complicated, but, you know, being more respectful of it in certain ways that it historically often wasn't, but also just being better as a role playing prompt that gets people more invested in their characters and exploring those ways of that, you know, like both expressing their own emotions and being able to empathize with the emotions of a character who is perhaps unlike them, which is very interesting and something that role-playing games are uniquely good at.
Yeah, and I would build on that and saying that I feel like early experiences were sort of in some ways trying to be simulationist, not necessarily very well, but often like these DSM definitions things were coming out of this attempt to sort of replicate reality in the game, right? And I actually think a lot of the most successful attempts and the most nuanced attempts actually move away from that and sort of engage more with metaphor and symbolism, right? There's a reason we talk so much of the darkest self mechanic, which is in no way directly ever references mental health, right? It's supposed to be kind of supernatural.
Most of these things we're talking about don't.
Right? And it's sort of like, oh, it's got to work as a game mechanic. It's got to work as a active role play. It doesn't matter if it's a good representation if it's not fun to do.
Yeah,
right.
Because like, I mean, honestly, one of the big issues with trying to just directly put DSM categories and like, okay, well, I have the, you know, ADHD trait or something, is that all of those are kind of each of those diagnoses are kind of a big bucket, and it'll be like, do you fit, you know, do you fit a majority of these sub traits? And like when if you try to write that into mechanics, like each of like a given person who has one of these like disorders is not going to be the same as someone else because they express different sub traits. And are you going to write that? How are you going to write that? And it becomes a huge mess to try to write any sort of rules for.
Yeah, right. And that is one of the main problems of the DSM is that in addition to categories overlapping with each other, right? You can have two people of the same thing and literally share no traits in common, right?
And it's like, are those really the same?
Right? And that's why there's been these other attempts of defining things in various different ways. Like I mentioned, like that high top where it's trying to focus on core traits that underlie these things and like internalizing versus externalizing and things. And, I don't know if it's entirely successful, right? Or these other more humanistic systems that try to view things through some other more metaphorical lens of like, you know, these different parts of the self or, you know, classic psychoanalysis stuff about the id and the ego and so on, right? Which I think that's as well is trying to find a mental health representation that kind of fits the setting and themes of your game, right? That if you're playing a horror game, I think it's okay to lean into a somewhat hopeless depiction of mental health, right? It doesn't need to be hopeful, right? You're kind of confronting the hopelessness in some ways of that people sometimes feel and sometimes experience of like, I'm not going to get better, right? And what does that mean for me, right? And, you know, I think that's been in some ways the predominant depiction, right? And so I'm like, okay, I would like to see more depictions of it being more hopeful, about, you know, living with it or, you know, the upsides of it or recovering, right? But yeah, really trying to find a system that connects with the themes that you want to express in your game. Okay, well, this has been Roast Playing Games. And I hope you have fun playing games and take good care of yourself.
And so do I.
Okay, bye.
Bye.